What if I told you the most painful break in your life was not random, but your mind finally forcing you to wake up from emotional dependency you mistook for love? Because when a powerful emotional bond breaks, it doesn't just end a connection, it reveals who was emotionally holding on and who was already letting go long before the separation. And here's the real question. Have you ever noticed that the deeper the emotional intensity, the harder it is to accept the ending, even when your mind already knows the truth? If yes, stay with this, because what you're about to hear will change how you understand emotional attachment forever. There are encounters in life so deep that you cannot simply dismiss them as coincidence. That very first moment, that gaze which feels both familiar and intense, creates a strange recognition in the heart, as if the soul has already known this presence from somewhere beyond the limits of time. When an empath meets a narcissist, it is never just an ordinary connection. It feels like a collision of two opposing forces, one made of emotional depth and sensitivity, and the other built around a guarded ego afraid of vulnerability. At the beginning, everything can feel like a meaningful love story written by fate itself. The empath may believe they have finally found someone who understands them at a soul level, someone they are meant to heal with and grow alongside. At the same time, the narcissist may feel they have found a source of admiration, a reflection that enhances their identity and gives them emotional validation. Both interpretations feel real, yet they come from completely different inner needs and perceptions of the same bond. Behind the intensity of attraction, emotional highs, and confusion, there often lies something deeper that many people fail to recognize. It feels like a kind of invisible agreement, as if two souls had crossed paths before this life and set conditions for this meeting. In this perspective, the empath carries a natural openness of heart, an ability to feel and absorb emotional energy, while the narcissistic pattern carries emotional avoidance and a need for external validation. When these two meet, it creates a powerful but unstable dynamic where each unconsciously triggers something within the other. However, what is often not understood is that when betrayal, emotional withdrawal, or denial enters this connection, the impact is not only emotional, it can feel as if something deeper inside begins to collapse, as though an inner structure has been shaken and reorganized at the same time. This experience often pushes the empath into a period of deep inner transformation, where identity, emotions, and understanding of love itself begin to shift. From the very beginning of this connection, there is often a strong sense of recognition that feels almost timeless. It is not experienced as a normal introduction between two people, but rather as an emotional overlap that feels ancient and immediate at the same time. Every interaction carries an unusual emotional weight, as if unspoken meaning exists behind every word and gesture. The empath often feels a deep emotional familiarity, interpreting the connection as something meaningful and destined. Meanwhile, the narcissistic pattern experiences the connection through reflection, seeing admiration and emotional attention as confirmation of worth. This difference creates an invisible imbalance from the start. While one side expands emotionally, the other begins to rely on that emotional energy for stability. Slowly, the emotional exchange becomes less about mutual connection and more about energetic dependence, even though both individuals may not consciously realize it at first. As the relationship develops, a subtle shift begins to occur that is not immediately visible but deeply felt. What once felt harmonious starts to become unstable. The empath continues to give emotionally, often trying to understand, support, and maintain the connection. However, the other side begins to withdraw internally while still receiving emotional energy. This creates an uneven flow, where one person feels increasingly drained while the other becomes emotionally detached. Over time, admiration may turn into control, emotional closeness may turn into confusion, and affection may become inconsistent. The empath begins to feel the emotional gap widening, even if no clear explanation is given. This phase is often the most painful because the shift is not direct or obvious. It happens gradually, through silence, emotional distance, and lack of clarity, making the empath question their own perception of reality. Eventually, the connection reaches a breaking point that may not always appear dramatic from the outside. There may be no clear ending, no final conversation that explains everything. Instead, it often feels like a sudden emotional disconnection that happens beneath words. One person begins to detach completely while the other is left trying to understand what changed. This moment can feel deeply unsettling because the emotional bond does not disappear instantly within the one who feels deeply. Instead, it continues to exist internally even after the external connection has ended. This creates a powerful emotional contrast between physical absence and internal presence, making the experience feel incomplete and difficult to process. When this separation happens, it often marks the beginning of an intense inner experience for the empath. Life may begin to feel different in subtle but noticeable ways. Thoughts become more reflective, emotions become stronger, and memories seem to carry new meaning. There can be moments where the past feels close and the present feels distant, as if the mind is processing two emotional realities at once. One reality is the external world where the connection is over, and the other is the internal world where emotional attachment is still active. This creates emotional confusion where feelings do not follow logic and understanding takes time to develop. In this stage, the mind and heart often struggle to align, creating an experience of emotional imbalance and deep reflection. During this phase, emotional intensity can rise unexpectedly. Feelings of sadness, anger, longing, and emptiness may appear at different times without clear triggers. It can feel as if emotions are moving in cycles rather than in a straight line. Some of these emotions may not even feel personal, as though they are connected to the memory of the bond itself rather than current events. This is because strong emotional experiences often leave lasting impressions on perception, making certain memories feel alive even after separation. The empath may find themselves revisiting moments repeatedly, trying to understand what happened and why it unfolded in that way. This reflection becomes part of the inner process of making sense of emotional loss. At the same time, life externally may begin to feel unsettled. Plans may feel unclear, motivation may fluctuate, and focus may shift repeatedly. This is not necessarily a sign of something wrong, but rather an indication that the internal emotional system is reorganizing itself. When a deeply emotional bond ends, especially one that had strong psychological and emotional impact, the mind often needs time to adjust to the absence. Old emotional patterns begin to weaken, while new understanding slowly begins to form. During this period, clarity does not come instantly. It develops gradually through reflection, awareness, and emotional processing. In this phase of inner change, even small emotional triggers can feel amplified. Memories, sounds, or familiar reminders may bring sudden emotional responses that feel stronger than expected. This is because emotional memory is not stored only in thoughts, but also in feelings and bodily responses. As a result, healing becomes a layered process that involves both emotional understanding and inner adjustment. Over time, the intensity begins to soften, not because the experience disappears, but because the mind learns to hold it differently. The same memory that once caused pain begins to transform into understanding, and slowly, emotional balance starts to return. Eventually, what once felt like emotional collapse begins to reveal itself as transformation. The inner world starts to reorganize in a quieter, more stable way. The emotional intensity that once felt overwhelming begins to settle into awareness. What remains is not just memory, but insight into how deeply human connection can affect perception, identity, and emotional growth. Not because life is pulling you back, but because something inside this experience is slowly coming to an end. What feels like signals or signs is not the universe calling you in a romantic direction, but your mind and heart finally processing the closing of a powerful emotional chapter. It is important not to romanticize this stage. Instead, it must be understood with clarity. When a deep emotional bond breaks, especially one that felt intense and consuming, the human psyche begins to reorganize itself. It creates meaning, patterns, and symbols to cope with what cannot be easily accepted. In reality, what is happening is psychological release. The mind is clearing emotional space so that life can continue forward in a healthier direction, even if it does not feel that way at first. During this period, a person often feels withdrawn, disconnected, and emotionally tired. Things that once felt meaningful may lose their emotional color for a while. This is a natural response of the nervous system after emotional overload. Psychologically, it is similar to a shutdown phase where the mind tries to protect itself by reducing emotional stimulation. Many people experience confusion during this stage because they try to find external meaning for internal emotional exhaustion. But what is actually happening is internal recalibration. The emotional system is trying to return to balance after being stretched too far for too long. There is no shortcut through this phase. It requires time, patience, and emotional acceptance rather than resistance. Eventually, with distance and reflection, something important begins to shift in understanding. The mind starts to see the relationship not as fate or mystery, but as experience and learning. The other person is no longer seen as a symbol or force, but as a human being who played a role in a personal emotional journey. This shift can feel painful at first, but it is also freeing. Instead of asking emotional questions like, "Why did this happen to me?" the mind slowly begins to ask more grounded questions like, "What did I learn from this?" or "What patterns within me were revealed through this experience?" This change in perspective marks emotional growth. It is the point where suffering begins to transform into understanding rather than repetition. As emotional acceptance deepens, life gradually starts to reorganize itself again. New experiences, new people, and new opportunities begin to appear naturally, not because anything magical is happening, but because emotional space has been cleared. When the mind is no longer stuck in constant emotional processing of the past, it becomes more open to the present. Small coincidences start to feel meaningful simply because awareness is sharper again. This is not external fate shifting, but internal perception becoming more receptive. Life has not changed its direction suddenly. Rather, the individual has become more available to notice what was always there. In this process, memories of the past connection may still arise from time to time. This is completely normal. The human brain stores emotionally intense experiences deeply, and they are often triggered by reminders, places, sounds, or feelings. However, these memories slowly lose their emotional charge as healing continues. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel like memory rather than present experience. This is a sign of emotional integration. The experience is no longer controlling the present moment. Instead, it becomes part of personal history, something understood rather than relived. Sometimes emotional attachment can create a strong internal echo even after separation. This can make a person feel as if they are still connected in some way, not through anything mystical, but through psychological bonding and emotional imprinting. When a connection is intense, the brain forms strong associative pathways. That is why thoughts, dreams, or sudden emotional reactions may still occur. It is not a sign of ongoing connection, but a sign that the mind is still processing emotional memory. Over time, these reactions weaken as the brain rewires itself through repetition, new experiences, and emotional distance. There is also a stage where a person may struggle with interpreting meaning from reminders or coincidences. The mind, in its attempt to find closure, may connect unrelated events to emotional memory. This is a natural cognitive process called pattern seeking. The brain tries to create order from emotional confusion. However, with awareness, a person begins to recognize that not every emotional trigger carries meaning beyond memory itself. This understanding reduces confusion and helps bring emotional grounding. Instead of seeing signs, the person begins to see triggers. Instead of mystery, they begin to see psychology. As emotional healing continues, a quiet shift happens internally. The intensity of emotional attachment begins to weaken, not suddenly, but gradually. There is more space between thought and reaction. The past still exists in memory, but it no longer dominates emotional reality. A person begins to feel more stable within themselves. This stability does not come from forgetting, but from understanding and integration. What once felt like emotional chaos becomes part of a broader story of personal growth and emotional learning. Eventually, there comes a point where the emotional weight of the experience no longer defines the present. The memory remains, but it no longer carries the same power. Life begins to feel lighter again, not because everything is perfect, but because the mind is no longer trapped in continuous emotional processing of the past. This is where real healing becomes visible. Not in dramatic change, but in quiet stability, in the ability to think about the past without being pulled back into it emotionally. And from this place, a deeper realization often emerges. What felt like loss was also transformation. What felt like confusion was also learning. And what felt like emotional collapse was also reconstruction of the self. The experience does not disappear, but its meaning changes completely. It becomes part of personal evolution rather than emotional pain. And in that understanding, a person slowly returns to themselves, not as they were before, but as someone with greater awareness, emotional depth, and inner clarity. No one sees it, no one really knows it, but inside their inner world, something begins to fall apart. Every illusion of control, every mask they carefully built, every role they created just to avoid feeling vulnerable, all of it slowly starts to break down. And the most painful part is that they can neither go back nor truly move forward. Going back would mean admitting responsibility, and moving forward would require real change. Both feel unbearable to the ego, so they remain stuck in a space where time feels heavy and nothing truly evolves. They start to sense something they cannot clearly define, a slow inner collapse that feels like disconnection from themselves. Everything that once made them feel powerful or in control starts turning into empty performance. They may still speak confidently, interact with others, and even appear emotionally expressive, but something essential is missing beneath it all. It becomes imitation rather than feeling. Their emotional world no longer feels alive from within. Instead, it depends on external reactions to feel real. When that external reflection weakens or disappears, their internal stability also begins to weaken. It feels as if they are no longer fully grounded in themselves, as though something they relied on for identity has been removed. At this stage, what feels like suffering does not come from the outside world, but from within their own mind. Thoughts they once avoided begin to surface again. Memories they pushed away start returning in fragments. The expression in someone's eyes they once hurt, the words spoken in moments of truth, the emotional presence they could not fully receive, all begin to reappear internally. These memories are not physical punishments, but psychological echoes that grow stronger in silence. At first, they try to reject them. Then they try to ignore them. But over time, these inner reminders become harder to silence. As they search for relief, they may try to move into new experiences, new relationships, or distractions that temporarily reduce discomfort. But none of it reaches the deeper layer where emptiness exists. Because what they are trying to escape is not external life, but internal awareness. They may keep changing surroundings, people, or situations, but the underlying feeling remains unchanged. There is a sense of incompleteness that follows them everywhere, no matter how much they try to cover it with activity or validation. Slowly, they begin to realize that external stimulation cannot replace internal stability. In moments of silence, the mind becomes more active. Old thoughts return without invitation. Situations are replayed again and again, not as they happened, but as they are now being reinterpreted. The mind tries to make sense of what was avoided before. There is resistance at first because self-reflection is uncomfortable when it contradicts the identity someone has built. But over time, avoidance becomes harder than awareness. This is where inner conflict intensifies, not because something new is happening, but because what was always present is no longer being suppressed in the same way. Meanwhile, the person who once held emotional significance in their life remains present in memory, not as an active connection, but as a psychological imprint. The mind revisits emotional moments because they were unresolved, not because they are still occurring. This creates internal tension where past experiences feel emotionally alive even though they belong to memory. It is not a mystical return, but the natural functioning of emotional attachment and unresolved processing within the human mind. As this continues, they may begin to feel a form of internal fragmentation. Their sense of identity, once built on external feedback, starts to feel unstable. They may appear functional on the surface, but internally there is confusion, restlessness, and emotional inconsistency. This does not happen as sudden collapse, but as gradual disconnection from the self that was maintained through external validation. Without that validation, they are left alone with their own internal state, which they may not yet understand or know how to process. At some point, awareness begins to form in fragments. Not complete understanding, but small realizations that something within their emotional structure is no longer functioning the same way. This can bring discomfort because it challenges the way they previously understood themselves and others. They may begin to recognize patterns they repeated, emotional reactions they avoided, or consequences of their actions they did not fully consider at the time. This awareness can feel heavy because it does not come as judgment from outside, but as reflection from within. For the person who once invested deeply, there is also a shift taking place. What once felt like emotional confusion slowly transforms into distance and clarity. The intensity of emotional attachment begins to fade, not through force, but through understanding and time. Memories still exist, but they no longer dominate emotional reality in the same way. The emotional charge attached to them gradually weakens, allowing space for stability to return. This is not forgetting, but integration. As both internal journeys continue in separate directions, a natural separation of emotional worlds takes place. One side moves through reflection and internal confrontation, while the other moves through recovery and rebuilding. These paths are no longer intertwined in the same way they once were. What remains is experience, understanding, and the gradual development of emotional awareness on both sides, even if it manifests differently for each person. In the end, what feels like loss often becomes transformation when seen with distance. What once felt like confusion becomes part of emotional learning. And what once felt like collapse becomes a turning point in personal development. The human mind does not remain static after intense emotional experiences. It reorganizes, adapts, and rebuilds meaning over time. What remains is not the connection itself, but the understanding gained through it, and the way it quietly reshapes how a person sees themselves, others, and emotional reality moving forward. In the end, what remains is not the story of what was lost, but the understanding of what was learned. Every experience, no matter how intense or confusing, becomes part of personal growth when seen with clarity and time. What once felt overwhelming slowly settles into memory, and what once felt unclear becomes easier to understand from a distance. People move forward at different paces, but life continues to guide everyone toward awareness, balance, and emotional maturity. The real conclusion is simple. You do not stay defined by what happened to you, but by how you choose to move forward from it. As time passes, emotional weight reduces, perspective expands, and inner stability returns. What remains is growth, self-awareness, and a deeper understanding of relationships and personal boundaries. In the end, every experience becomes a step toward becoming more grounded, more aware, and more at peace within yourself.